This webinar is going to cover the peripheral nervous system, specifically referring to spinal nerves and peripheral nerves. So we'll be talking about spinal nerves and various peripheral nerves, but also briefly the connective tissue wrappings that are associated with the various nerves. So kind of an overview first is the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is the sensory receptors, the peripheral nerves, the spinal nerves, and cranial nerves. The peripheral nervous system's job is to relaying various information, sensory information from, say, touch receptors or pain receptors. That will be carried towards the central nervous system. That's why they refer to as the afferent division. The central nervous system will be involved in kind of integrating that information, figuring out what information we're receiving and what to do about it. And one of the ways it knows what to do about it is via the motor division of the peripheral nervous system, or efferent, where we'll have motor impulses going out via the spinal nerves and then peripheral nerves, causing, for example, maybe a muscle to contract and a limb to move. So here is a picture that kind of gives you a kind of a big picture thing of the same thing we just talked about. This is showing a reflex, and we'll say is if you touch, say, a hot pan, the pain receptor, which would be right in here, the pain receptor is going to be sending the information towards the central nervous system. And in this, here's the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system, but it's going to be sent through these nerves. The central nervous system is then going to integrate that information, figure out what to do. One of the things immediately is going to happen is you're going to send out motor information to the muscles of that, say, arm. That's going to allow me to withdraw my hand from that painful stimulus. If I touch a hot pan, I would hope to withdraw from it. But also you'll see we have information that's also going up to the brain, where then your brain processes the fact that you just burned yourself. So the peripheral nervous system is bringing sensory information to the central nervous system and then carrying motor information out. Now, these pictures demonstrate what you would see in lab, and what you're seeing here on the right, these are representing the various spinal nerves, which you see here on either side. And the spinal nerves eventually will carry fibers, which then will become the peripheral nerves. And what you're seeing, all the yellow here, these are all represent the peripheral nerves. So they're going to be innervating various structures in the skin and skeletal muscles. Now, first one to do is we're going to classify our nerves. Nerves can be classified as being mixed nerves, purely sensory nerves, or motor nerves. All of the nerves of all the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. So I'm going to put spinal nerves here. So all the spinal nerves are mixed nerves. All of the peripheral nerves are mixed nerves. There's going to be also some cranial nerves that are going to be considered mixed nerves. So first I got to tell you what mixed nerves is. You can read, but I'm going to go over it again. Mixed nerves have sensory nerve fibers as well as motor nerve fibers. So why don't you think of it as a road, a road that allows traffic to go in both directions. So it's carrying sensory information as well as motor information. The cranial nerves that are considered to be mixed nerves and we're going to talk about this at a later date, but I'm going to introduce them to you now, is cranial nerves 5, 7, 9, and 10. You'll notice the way I'm writing the cranial nerves is in Roman numerals. That's what we use for the cranial nerves. So at a later date, you'll learn what those nerves mean. There are some sensory nerves or some nerves that are considered purely sensory. Those are going to only be cranial nerves. The cranial nerves that are purely sensory is cranial nerves 1, 2, and 8. So they'll be carrying information in regards to special senses like vision and smell and hearing and equilibrium. Now, some cranial nerves are also that are classified as purely motor nerves. They carry only motor information, only have efferent fibers. The cranial nerves that are considered to be purely motor are cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, 11, and 12. That's an X. So you'll notice that mixed nerves, all the peripheral nerves, including the spinal nerves, they're completely mixed. You will have some that are some of the cranial nerves that are mixed nerves. The only nerves that are purely sensory or purely motor are cranial nerves. The sensory nerves only have afferent fibers. The motor nerves only have efferent fibers. So we're going to discuss in this lecture is mixed nerves. Now the mixed nerves, I'm going to show you kind of like the structure of nerves in general, is the nerves have connective tissue wrappers that surround them. And if we look at a nerve, this picture here represents an entire nerve. The entire nerve is surrounded by a wrapper called the epineurium. The epineurium, the function, just kind of go over it, it's a connective tissue. Connective tissues, remember, connect, they support, they protect. So what this thing is going to be is kind of keeping all these different components that are part of the nerve together and give a little bit of structure, but also going to be supporting things like larger blood vessels that are coming into the nerve. The nerve is composed up of nerve fascicles. The nerve fascicles, or fascicle, is a bundle of axons. So you see here, this says nerve fascicle, and it's actually nerve fascicle because there's such thing as a muscle fascicle too, so I don't want you to confuse them. But a fascicle, I think it's a bundle. So we have these bundles, and they're bundles of axons. An individual axon will be carrying either sensory information or be carrying motor information. So what we have in one complete nerve is we have all these axons. So all the individual axons are surrounded by a connective tissue wrapper referred to as the endoneurium. And the endoneurium will surround the myelin if it's a myelinated nerve. But we have this endoneurium. Then each of the axons are bundled together in what referred to as that nerve fascicle, and that's surrounded by the perineurium. And then all of the fascicles are bundled together to comprise your nerve, and the nerve is surrounded by the epineurium. Now overall, as I had kind of mentioned with the epineurium previously, is they protect, they support. They're going to kind of give it some structure, plus also support all these blood vessels that we see here, because nerves need to have a blood supply. They need to receive their nourishment. They need to receive oxygen. You need to remove waste products from it. In lab, you're going to look at this under a microscope, and you'll see the connective tissue wrappers associated with each nerve. What I want to start with is looking at the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are named because they're going to emerge from the spinal cord. The spinal nerves will exit via something referred to as the intervertebral foramen, which are openings in between the vertebra. So if you look at the picture over on the right, here is the first lumbar vertebra, here's the second lumbar vertebra, and you notice right here, that is a lumbar spinal nerve. So the spinal nerves are coming in between each of the vertebrae. So on the left picture, you'll notice though we have spinal nerves that emerge on either side of the spinal cord, and they're paired. If you look at this, the spinal nerves, which again are all mixed nerves, so they're carrying sensory and motor information, is the spinal nerves are paired nerves, and we have certain numbers of them. And the naming of them, the naming of each of the nerves is derived from the spinal cord segment from which it arises. We have 8 spinal cord segments that are cervical spinal cord segments, and so what we have is 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. So 8 pairs, that means 16 cervical spinal nerves. We have 12 thoracic spinal cord segments, so we end up having 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves. Then we've got 5 pairs of lumbar nerves. We've got 5 pairs of sacral spinal nerves, and we have 1 pair of the coccygeal spinal nerves. So total, we have how many pairs of spinal nerves? We have 31 pairs. So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which is total is 62 spinal nerves. Later, in another lecture, we'll talk about the actual spinal cord. Now we're just discussing the spinal nerves. Now if you look at this picture, again, you see that the spinal nerves come out, just like I saw in the previous picture, come from between the vertebrae, and they're referred to as the intervertebral foramen. Foramen means opening. And so an intervertebral foramen is an opening between the vertebrae. So they emerge out, and what you'll notice is that they're going to branch, and we'll talk about these branches very shortly. But what the spinal nerve is here's the spinal nerve, which you see right here, it's where these two structures come together. And we'll be discussing this very shortly. The dorsal root is carrying sensory information. The ventral root is carrying motor information. And when they two come together, that is your spinal nerve. And that's what comes out between those intervertebral foramen. Now, if you look at the naming of the spinal nerves, the spinal nerves I had mentioned are named for the segments of the spinal cord from which they arise. But it's easier for people can't feel the spinal cord. What they feel are the vertebrae, and those are palpable. So knowing kind of where the location of these spinal nerves relative to the vertebrae is going to be more important for you. So I'm going to show you kind of how you can figure out which spinal nerve is coming out where. Now it's important to note that the spinal cord segments are variable in length, and the segments don't necessarily correspond to the vertebral segments. The vertebra is the bone. The vertebrae are palpable, like I said, so it's useful to know the segments relative to the vertebra. The cervical spinal nerves are named, or where you can figure out, their first 7 are going to be easier for you. The first cervical spinal nerves will leave between, or I should say, exit above the first cervical vertebra. The first cervical vertebra is referred to as your atlas. The second cervical vertebra is referred to as your axis. The rest of the vertebra of the cervical part of the vertebra is they don't have any specific names. But the first cervical spinal nerve leaves before the first cervical vertebra. The second spinal nerves leave before the second cervical vertebra. So all the cervical spinal nerves except for C8 is going to exit above the corresponding vertebra. Now, there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there's 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves. So the 8th one, you'll see, exits below C7. There's no such thing as a C8 cervical vertebra. So that's kind of the odd man out. Everything down from there, then the particular spinal nerves will always exit below the corresponding vertebra. So the first thoracic spinal nerve leaves after the first thoracic vertebra. The second thoracic spinal nerve leaves after the second thoracic vertebra, and on and on and on. And here, I'm just going to show you here, this is a lab model just depicting the lumbar and the sacral vertebra. So I had mentioned before, here's the first lumbar vertebra. That's the vertebra, the bone. Here's second, this is the second, third, fourth, fifth. So there's 5 lumbar vertebrae, and there are also 5 pairs of lumbar spinal nerves. Now here, this is the first lumbar spinal nerve. So we call it L1 spinal nerve. Notice it's leaving after the first lumbar vertebra. Then you got L2, L3, L4, L5. So L1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this picture, in the angle, you're not going to be able to see the spinal ones, but at least you can see the 5 on one side of 5 of the lumbar spinal nerves. So we'll also have it on the other side. It's going to be very important that when you're, say, in lab and you're identifying the spinal nerves, is you'll identify it by a letter and a number, and you must end it with spinal nerve because there's a vertebra. So if I say L1, L1 what? Vertebra or spinal nerve. So make sure that you remember to do that. So if we go on, a short distance after the spinal nerve passes through the intervertebral foramen, which you see right here. There's a spinal nerve right there. It will branch. And so we're going to talk about this branch, and this branch. So I'm going to go back to this picture, then we'll go back there. This is showing you, here's the spinal cord, here's the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is going to branch into a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus, and we have this thing called rami communicantes. Ramus means branch, okay? Ramus equals branch. If I use the term rami, that's plural for ramus, okay? So we have a dorsal ramus, a ventral ramus. Dorsal means back, ventral means front. So this is anatomical terminology that you should already be aware of. Well, the dorsal ramus is a branch that serves the back, structures in your actual back. So it can be carrying sensory information from your back. It could be carrying motor information to the back, since this is a mixed nerve. The ventral ramus is going to be carrying sensory and motor fibers to all the other structures that are found in the body wall and in your limbs. The rami communicantes means communicating branches. This is going to be important in the lecture when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. One of the things that will carry, though, as you can see on this picture, it does carry sensory information from visceral organs along this area right here. So this picture is just depicting sensory fibers, but I had mentioned that the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus also has motor fibers. Now you have this picture in your notes which is depicting the motor fibers. So you see you have motor fibers in the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus, and in also that rami communicantes, which will be very important in the autonomic nervous system. So there are different branches of the spinal nerve. Some is going to be taking information towards the back or bringing information from the back. That'll be your dorsal ramus. The ventral ramus is going to be bringing sensory information from the body wall and the limbs and carrying motor information out. The rami communicantes will be very important in the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk about that much more in depth when we discuss the autonomic nervous system. Now this picture is a model from lab that's depicting a section of the spinal cord with the vertebra associated with it. And here, this is the spinal nerve right there. This right there is the dorsal ramus. This is the ventral ramus. And right in here, this is the rami communicantes. So so hopefully you'll get that in lab. So we'll talk about also these other little structures very shortly, which you see here and there. Now, one important clinical aspect of understanding the spinal nerves is something called dermatomes. Dermatomes, derm means skin. A dermatome is an area of the skin that the sensory nerve fibers of a single spinal nerve innervates. So if you'll notice, if you look at the picture, is you have dermatomes that are along the thorax and the abdomen. They kind of stack up and kind of like form that trunk, the body. The dermatomes along the legs and the arms the pattern's a little bit different. They run longitudinally along the limbs. The general pattern is about the same for everybody, but the precise areas of innervation are unique, kind of like a fingerprint. But this is used clinically, say, for example, what this picture is showing you says, well, actually it's cut off so you can't see it, is if someone has, say, a spinal cord injury, and they want to evaluate if what particular spinal nerves are affected, is they can touch different areas that are along the body region, and they could try to localize what particular spinal nerves are affected. Now, symptoms that follow a dermatome, like pain, could be a pain, it could be rash, they may indicate pathology associated with a particular or nerve root of a spinal nerve. So kind of like, for an example, if they want to test, say, the C6, you'll notice that they'll say touch the thumb. So if maybe there's some sensory loss, they'll touch the thumb. That could be the C6 spinal nerve, or there may be pain associated with the thumb that could be associated with the C6 spinal nerve. Now, one thing I do want to mention is if you look carefully at this picture, there is no C1 dermatome. That's the only one that does not have a dermatome, but everyone else does have a dermatome. So that's kind of a interesting thing. C1 does not have a dermatome. Now I want to talk about the spinal nerves. After they emerge from the spinal cord, they're going to, a large number of them will form these networks called plexus, or they're called branching networks. Now they are branches, they derive from the ventral rami, the anterior branches of the spinal cord. So it's important to remember the anterior branches or the ventral rami of the spinal cord. Now the only nerves that don't participate in a plexus is a large number of your thoracic ones. So T2 to T12 are not associated with a plexus or a network. So plexus means network. So kind of understanding some terminology is going to help you at a later date. So I'm going to write this down. Plexus equals network. So we're going to talk about the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. These are going to innervate general structures in the body, and then the fibers that become certain nerves, say your sciatic nerve or your median nerve, they derive from various fibers that originate from a particular plexus. The cervical plexus in general is going to serve structures, just like the name cervical means neck, so it's going to be innervate muscle structures of the neck, the superior part of the chest. Also going to innervate something called the diaphragm. So that's, and with each of the plexus, I'm only pick one or two nerves that I want you to know. So don't worry about having to memorize every nerve in the body. So I want you to generally know the general area of structures that are innervated by each plexus, and maybe a couple of the nerves. So the cervical plexus, which is derived from the ventral rami of C1 all the way to part of C5. Now all of the fifth cervical spinal nerve forms the cervical plexus. The diaphragm is a major nerve that I want you to remember that is derived from the cervical plexus. The nerve. The diaphragm is a structure innervated by the phrenic nerve that is from the cervical plexus. The phrenic nerve is derived from C3, C4, and C5. A way to remember it is C3, C4, C5 keep the diaphragm alive. Now the diaphragm is your major muscle of breathing, of inspiration. So if that is damaged, you're going to die because you need that to breathe. Or if it's paralyzed, say in someone who has poliomyelitis, that's where old school used to see them in the iron lungs. So the diaphragm or the phrenic nerve is the one nerve from the cervical plexus that I want you to remember. The brachial plexus, brachial, think arm. The brachial plexus is originates from the ventral rami of part of C5 through the first thoracic spinal nerve. So C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1. The brachial plexus innervates structures within the arm. There's 5 major nerves associated with the brachial plexus: axillary, musculocutaneous, median, radial, and ulnar. I only picked 2 for you to remember, so we're going to go through those 2. The median nerve has cutaneous innervation on the palmar side of your thumb, your index finger, and your middle finger, and half of your ring finger. So you'll see it over here on the left. Okay, so you can see kind of where it innervates. Plus just on the back part of your second and third finger, and a little bit half of your ring finger, so it's a little bit over here too. So median nerve damage, if you're someone say touching there, they might have sensory loss for there. The median nerve also innervates structures, innervates most flexors of the forearm. And also innervates or has motor information some of the muscles of the first and second fingers and your thumb. So I'm going to show you kind of some of the things that it does. One of the things is involved in wrist flexion. So flexion, so I'm going to start introducing some movements. Flexion is where you have it's a movement in the sagittal plane that decreases the angle of a joint and brings 2 bones closer together. So if this is on the bottom picture, it's showing you wrist flexion. So that's one of the things that the median nerve does, is it innervates muscles and allow you to flex the wrist. It's also involved in pronation. Pronation is where the forearm rotates medially, so the palm faces posteriorly, so kind of palm facing down. The other thing that's going to be involved in, since it innervates muscles of the wrist, is it's going to be involved in wrist abduction. Wrist abduction is also referred to as radial deviation. Abduction is a word in which you move a limb away from midline of the body. So if you kind of think of this as someone's left hand, and if they're moving their left hand away from the midline, so here say it would be where like the belly button would be and the legs here. If they're moving the wrist away from the midline, that's wrist abduction. They call it radial deviation because there involves moving the limb closer to the radial styloid, which is one of your bones of your forearm. So far, the median nerve's involved in wrist abduction, pronation, and wrist flexion. Okay. Another thing it's involved in, it innervates some of the muscles of your first and second fingers and your thumb. So this is the first finger, that's the second finger, or I should say, they call it second and third. Yeah, first and second finger. Sorry. And here's your thumb. One of the things it does, it's involved in thumb flexion. So you see here, thumb flexion. Opposition is a term in which you take the thumb and you touch the thumb to any of the other fingers. So that's opposition. Another thing it will be involved in is it's going to allow you to flex your first and second finger. So here, this finger here, that finger here is flexion. So this picture is showing you flexion, where you're decreasing the angle between bones. So knowing kind of what it does with your fingers, innervates muscles involved, you can pretty much move your thumb, your first and second fingers, is if you have damage to the median nerve, it can result in something you see here. This is referred to as the benediction sign. It's kind of like the people who are Catholic would understand this, is when the Pope blesses you, they kind of have that, they have this hand look to it. But the benediction sign in regards to damage to the median nerve is associated where if someone's asked to make a fist, they can't. They have problems flexing these fingers and the thumb because of damage to that nerve, so it results in a benediction sign. Now the radial nerve has cutaneous innervation to you see here that's going to be depicted in blue. So it has to most of it's pretty much a lot of the back of the hand, right in here, and palmar side a little bit in part of your thumb. So the median nerve has a little bit different sensory innervation than either of the other nerves. Now the radial nerve also has motor innervation to the triceps brachii, which is one of the extensors, or it's a dorsal muscle of the arm, and it's an extensor. So it allows you to extend the elbow at the elbow joint. So going from here up is elbow extension. Another thing that it would do is it innervates muscles of the extensors of the wrists and the hands. So it's going to be involved in wrist extension. So remember, the median nerve was involved in wrist flexion. The radial nerve is involved in wrist extension, and also going to be involved in extending the thumb. So here's extension of the thumb, and it also allows you to straighten your fingers. So extend. So here, this would be extension of the fingers, kind of like opposite of what the median nerve, extension of the fingers. So if there is damage to the radial nerve, this is what can happen. You can have wrist drop. So they're not going to be able to extend up their wrist. They're not going to be able to straighten up their fingers. So that's what can happen with damage to the radial nerve. Now the lumbar plexus is going to innervate structures in the lower limbs, in the pelvic girdle. The two that we're going to look at is the genitofemoral nerve and the femoral nerve. Those are the two that we're going to look at. The genitofemoral nerve originates from L1 and L2 spinal nerves, okay? And the femoral nerve is going to have fibers that come from L2 through L4. Now the sensory innervation of the genitofemoral nerve, just kind of look at the name genital and think genitals, is it does innervate skin over the anterior medial surface of the thigh and parts of the external genitalia. So you kind of can see here where in the light blue, you can kind of see in the light blue the innervation from the genitofemoral nerve. Also, it's in the males, it'll be innervate parts of the scrotum. In the females, it will innervate parts of, referred to as the mons pubis in the females. So scrotum in the male and female mons pubis. Now the genitofemoral nerve also has motor. And the one I use as an example because it's something that it's discussed in AMP2 is something called the cremasteric reflex. How the physician will evaluate this reflex is they'll lightly stroke the inside of the thigh of the male, and what will happen is it'll cause the scrotum on the same side to be pulled up. They're doing that to test proper functioning of that particular nerve. That reflex is actually diminished in someone, a young boy. It's often young boys that you see this that have a twisted spermatic cord or testicular torsion. So they use this to kind of evaluate that. Now the femoral nerve is the largest branch of the lumbar plexus, and it originates from L2 to L4. It innervates the anterior thigh muscles, and also muscles of the hip. That allows us to adduct the hips and flex the hip. So I'm going to look at, before we do that, let's just look at the sensory innervation. So it does innervate the skin over the anterior medial thigh, surface of the thigh, so the front and to the side of the thigh. So you see here in a kind of yellow. So anterior medial surface of the thigh and the medial surface of the leg. So right here. Okay. The motor functions, as I said, it innervates the anterior thigh muscles. So what it's going to be involved in is the anterior thigh muscles are going to involve, if we go from here up, they're involved in knee extension at the knee, the muscles that are involved there. It's also going to be involved in flexion of the hip. So what you see here, hip flexion, and adduction. So here's adduction. Adduction is where I mentioned abduction. Adduction is when you move a limb toward the midline. So it's the opposite of abduction. So femoral nerve innervates the muscles that allow you to do those various movements. The last plexus and the two nerves I want to talk about are derived from the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is from L4 to S5, and we're going to look at the sciatic nerve, and we're also going to look at the pudendal nerve, which I have here. So the pudendal nerve. So the sciatic nerve is the first one. The sciatic nerve starts in your lower back, and it runs down through your buttock and then down the lower part of your leg. So you can see here it runs down the back part of your leg. This is the largest diameter nerve and the longest nerve that we have in the body. The sciatic nerve, the innervation, it does innervate all of the skin of the lower leg and the foot, except for the medial surface of the leg. Okay, so that was by that femoral nerve. So it does have sensory innervation for all parts of that lower leg and the foot, with that one exception of the medial surface. The motor function is it innervates the muscles of the posterior thigh. So like the hamstring groups, the hamstring muscles. So I'm just going to bring up the hamstrings. So it does kind of the opposite of what the femoral nerve would do. Femoral nerve was involved in knee extension. This is knee flexion right here. So decreasing the angle at the knee. It also innervates muscles involved in medial rotation of the hip, and also going to be involved in hip extension. Okay? So medial rotation of the hip and hip extension. So that's what some of what the sciatic nerve and its branches do. The last one, oh sorry, not the last one, here's some more of the motor, is it does innervate all the muscles of the foot. And so these are some more of the movements involved in the foot. Plantar flexion, where you point your toes. Dorsiflexion is where you lift the foot so the superior surface approaches your shins. Inversion and eversion. So inversion is when you turn your sole towards midline or medially. Eversion is where you turn the sole of your foot laterally. And we can demonstrate for you these movements in lab too. But the sciatic nerve, its branches are going to be involved in all the movements of your foot. Now the last nerve is the pudendal nerve. The pudendal nerve gets its name from the word pudenda. It's an E, pudenda, which means parts to be ashamed of, because it innervates parts that people really don't want to talk about. So it innervates muscles of the perineum. Now the perineum is this region between the anus and, in the female, the vagina. In the males, the perineum is the area between the base of the penis to the anus. So it innervates muscles in that region. Skin of the external genitalia, no one wants to talk about that. It also innervates the external anal sphincter, which is depicted on this picture here, and the external urethral sphincter. So I'm going to show you in the male, it's going to be innervate in parts of the scrotum here in the male. It innervates the penis. So again, if people don't really want to talk about parts to be ashamed of. And it also innervates the external urethral sphincter, which is skeletal muscle. So it's very involved in defecation. This is both males and females. And it's also innervates the external urethral sphincter, and it's showing you in the male and the female. Male on the left, the female on the right. This is involved in, the fancy term is called micturition. M-I-C-T-U-R-I-T-O-N. So which is pretty much urination. So here's something to remember is the pudendal nerve is derived from S2, S3, and S4, which keep the poo and the pee off the floor. It's a way to remember the pudendal nerve and what it innervates, because the external urethral and anal sphincters are very involved in keeping the poop and the pee off the floor. That's a mnemonic that some people learn to try to remember, and it works for me. So you've got the pudendal nerve and the sciatic nerve, which are derived from the sacral plexus. You've got the genitofemoral nerve and the femoral nerve from the lumbar plexus, the median radial nerve from the brachial plexus, and the phrenic nerve from the cervical plexus. So those are the only peripheral nerves that I'm going to have you remember, because there's just way too many. So this will be the end of this part on covering the peripheral nerves and the spinal nerves.